Next up at number 3, we're going to talk about The Summer Book by Tove Jansson. Originally published in 1972, the most recent edition to be published in English by NYRB came out in 2008 and it was translated by Thomas Teal. We're going to match this up against Refried Ectoplasm Volume 2 by Stereolab, which is a compilation of the band's singles and rarities that were released during a very creatively fruitful portion of their career in 1992 and 93. I thought The Summer Book was a great complement to Refried Ectoplasm because it has a very episodic structure. The book basically consists of a series of 22 vignettes focusing on the adventures of a 6-year-old girl, Sophia, and her grandmother as they spend their summer on a rather remote island in the Gulf of Finland. As someone who is generally indoorsy, to put it lightly, and as a reader who generally shies away from sentimental slice-of-life type fiction, it says a lot about the quality of Jansson's writing and her deliciously dark sense of humor that I ended up loving this book as much as I did. Underneath the poetic descriptions of the raw, untamed beauty of the island setting, and the sometimes fairy tale-like imaginings of our 6-year-old protagonist, there's this wonderful deadpan sense of humor. There's this great exchange that happens when Sophia adopts a cat named Ma Petite, which they end up referring to as Moppy. Moppy, following her feline instincts, begins presenting the family each morning with the gift of dead birds she acquired on her late-night hunting expeditions. Moppy's killer instincts disturb Sophia, who is decidedly pro-bird, and as tensions mount between pet and owner, the grandmother tries to help smooth things over a bit with little positive effect. It says, "Every night the cat went into the woods, and every morning it killed its prey and carried it into the house to be admired, and every morning the bird was thrown into the sea. A little while later, Sophia would appear outside the window and shout, 'Can I come in? Have you taken out the body?' She punished Moppy and increased her own pain by means of terrible coarseness. 'Have you cleaned up the blood?' she would yell, or 'How many murdered today?' And morning coffee was no longer what it had been." Similarly, Stereolab employs a kind of bright, groovy aesthetic throughout most of their songs, heavily influenced by French pop and lounge music from the 1960s, and the pleasantly repetitive, sort of chugging guitar work, dun 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 dun, characteristic of many well-known German rock bands such as Kraftwerk and Can. But lurking just behind that pleasant facade is a deeply intellectual, almost haunting consideration of social and class struggle. One of the early tracks, Low Boob Oscillator, has lyrics that seem to be simply admiring the beauty of the changing phases of the moon, which upon deeper examination actually seem to refer to great historical cycles of struggle where the proletariat rises up and overthrows their oppressors. And after about 3 minutes of this socialist sing-along, the track sort of disintegrates into another equally lengthy passage of droning rhythmic noise rock. And the complementary effect of these bright aesthetics paired with a somewhat darker, weightier subject matter works just as well in The Summer Book. Because while each little story at first feels mostly self-contained, typically wrapping things up on a fairly positive note, subtle, sinister themes start to pop up between each of these stories. Like Sophia's rarely mentioned dead mother, a loss that seems to underlie the particular strength of her relationship with her grandmother. Then there's the grandmother's apparently declining health, episodes which at first just seem like the general fatigue that comes along with maintaining an active lifestyle at an old age, suddenly seem far more grave as repeated references are made to a medication that the grandmother is completely dependent on for her continued well-being. There's a kind of touching scene where they discover what looks like a naturally formed altar inside a cave, and the grandmother leaves a bottle of these pills there almost as tribute. There's also a sense throughout these stories that on their little island, Sophia and her grandmother have almost created their own little pocket universe, located somewhere out of normal space and time, and operating according to its own sense of logic. As in the music of Stereolab, Jansson has crafted a work of fiction that, while it's very much informed by the past, classical modes of storytelling, such as myths and adventure narratives, the final product still ends up feeling utterly distinctive, very much doing its own thing. For example, in one of my favorite sections of the book, Sophia learns that when the body of an earthworm is divided into 2 separate halves, each half can go on living independently of one another. And so she decides to write a scientific treatise, her grandmother performing the role of transcriber, about what happens to these 2 halves after they've been split. and the tone quickly shifts from one of pseudo-scientific observation to something that almost feels more like philosophy or free verse. Here's Sophia dictating to her grandmother. She says, "Presumably everything that happened to them after that only seemed like half as much, but this was also sort of a relief. And then, too, nothing they did was their fault anymore somehow. They just blamed each other, or else they'd say that after a thing like that, you weren't yourself anymore. There is one thing that makes it more complicated, and that is that there is such a big difference between the front end and the back end. A worm never goes backwards, and so, for that reason, it has its head only at one end. But if God made angleworms so that they can come apart and then grow out again, there must be some sort of secret nerve that leads out in the back end so that later on it can think. Otherwise, it couldn't get along by itself. But the back end has a very tiny brain. It can probably remember its other half, which went first and made all the decisions. And so now," said Sophia, sitting up, "now the back end says, which way should I grow out? Should I make a new tail, or should I make a new head? Should I go on following and never have to make any important decisions, or should I be the one who always knows best until I come apart again? That would be exciting. But maybe he's so used to being the tail that he just lets things go on the way they are." "Did you write everything I said?" "Every word," grandmother said. So yeah, come for the childhood whimsy, stay for the existential worm musings. And though both Refried Ectoplasm and the summer book might seem somewhat fragmentary at first glance, the wit and overall artistic vision of their creators ultimately binds them together into something much greater than the sum of their parts.